In this video, we're going to look at what homeostasis is and why it's so important to life. So homeostasis means maintaining a stable internal environment. And what this means is that cells and organisms have to keep conditions within a particular range to maintain the necessary function. So if things get outside of this range, bad things happen. And this is important because, as we've talked about, organisms and cells need specific conditions for all their reactions to work correctly. And external conditions, so things outside the cell or outside the organism, are going to change, and the organism has to be able to respond appropriately to survive. Because if it doesn't, then it's going to get outside of the range of conditions that it can survive, and it's going to die. So here's just a basic example of how temperature can impact performance. So within this range of temperatures, these organisms can survive, grow, and reproduce. Everything's good, that's how they're supposed to be. If the conditions get outside of that, then they can no longer reproduce. They can survive and grow, but they can't reproduce. If they get a little more extreme, they're just basically holding on and surviving, and if they get even more extreme, they die. So the organisms need to maintain their temperature within a particular range in order to do all the things that they need to do to survive and reproduce. So one of those things is organisms need the right things in the right places in the right amounts. So we're talking about things like the substrates for your enzyme reactions, molecules to communicate, materials for building cell structures and molecules. All of those things need to get to the right places at the right times. I also need a lot of energy to make these reactions happen. So we're talking glucose. That's something that really has to be maintained. We're talking about making ATP in response to things. And a big thing here is understanding that maintaining homeostasis is going to take a lot of energy because we're having to move a lot of things, we're having to do reactions. All of this kind of stuff takes a lot of energy. Now, environmental conditions are going to impact reactions. So things like pH, temperature, water availability, and concentration all can impact reactions. We know that pH and temperature are important because they actually impact the enzymes themselves. So how does homeostasis generally work? Well, it's going to involve a lot of transport of materials using feedback mechanisms. Basically what this means is materials are going to be moved in response to how much is present versus how much is actually needed. So it's going to respond to that change, and that's the feedback mechanism aspect. And this is going to help keep things in the right balance. So for example, let's say this is a molecule that the cell needs. There's too much outside the cell and there's not enough inside the cell. So what's going to happen is the cell is going to use energy in a lot of cases in order to actually move material inside the cell to maintain the right balance. And this is going to happen through the process of transport, which we'll talk about in another lesson. And this can be active transport using energy or passive transport, which doesn't use energy in the processes of osmosis and diffusion. And again, we'll talk a lot more about this in the next lesson. Now, at the cellular level, materials are transported in and out of cells in order to maintain homeostasis. And this happens across the plasma membrane because, remember, it is selectively permeable. It controls how things move. At an organism level, systems are going to work together to respond to changes. So you've got lots of organs, you've got lots of different types of cells. All of those are going to respond to changes as an overall system. So we're going to look at a stimulus, which is a change in your environment. It's going to cause a response, either a behavior or physiological change, which is a change in your body conditions. So for example, if the temperature changes, that's a stimulus. Your response might be, if it's getting hotter, to sweat. If it's getting colder, to shiver. If your water balance is off, if you don't have enough, it's going to cause you to be thirsty. If you have too much, your body's going to get rid of that excess through the urinary system. Let's say you're running. Your body is going to use lots of different systems, your lungs, your heart, your circulatory system, in order to move oxygen and materials to your muscles so that you can actually maintain what's going on. And finally, this is just an example where a polar bear is able to live in these really cold conditions because it uses a lot of energy to keep its body temperature high so that all of its reactions can happen. If you were to put a cold-blooded animal like a snake in the Arctic, it's going to die because it can't maintain that body temperature. It can't maintain homeostasis in that way. So the key takeaways here are homeostasis means keeping things the same so that everything functions correctly. This takes a lot of energy, and it requires a lot of moving of materials in order to maintain that balance.